The first strangeness does not come from the stars. It comes from the quiet realization that the universe never asked for us. Not once. Not in any equation. Not in any physical law. Not in any whisper hidden beneath cosmic background radiation. And yet, here we are, these trembling sparks of awareness trapped inside a cosmos colder, older, and far more indifferent than our minds were ever designed to comprehend. Something in that indifference unsettles the darkest corner within us, as if we are intruders wandering through a cathedral built for no one, lit by an altar of collapsing suns. If the universe had a face, it would not be smiling, nor frowning. It simply would not be looking at all. And still, consciousness emerged like a silent flash, an interruption in the cosmic monotony, a glitch so faint that the universe itself did not stop to notice. You breathe in the dark, and the dark does not breathe back. You reach toward the void, and the void does not extend a hand. Yet somehow, thought appears. Somehow, a mind forms. Somehow, a creature made of dust begins to watch the very dust it came from. A cold mist hangs over this truth. No physical law was ever written with the intention of creating a being capable of asking why those laws exist. Awareness was not a requirement. It was not even permitted until it suddenly was. If particles could speak, they would deny knowing anything about you. They move because motion is what they do, not because they want to become a neuron or a dream or a memory. Quarks and leptons do not pray to become stars. Stars do not long to become planets. Planets do not hope to birth life. And life does not need to become conscious to survive. Something went wrong or right depending on how you define the curvature of this story. But in the earliest moments, in the dark flash before the first mind flickered awake, nothing suggested that a self would ever appear inside this universe of relentless silence. Nothing required intention, nothing required meaning, nothing required you. You're listening to Whispers of the Universe. And if you feel gentle enough to support this quiet place, even the smallest sign from you helps it remain alive in the dark. And as that whisper fades, we return to the unsettling truth. The universe operates without empathy, without desire, without even the faintest trace of preference. Physics is a script read by an actor who does not know it is performing. The laws do not bend to accommodate life. Life bends itself, breaks itself, contorts itself, just to survive under the weight of those laws. Consciousness, then, is the most fragile rebellion ever mounted. It is the faint defiance of atoms against the tyranny of meaninglessness. But atoms do not rebel. They do not desire rebellion. That desire comes from you, and you are made of them. How did something so cold produce something that longs for warmth? Before consciousness, there were only collisions, particles striking each other like tiny stones thrown by a blind universe. These collisions spiraled into chemistry. Chemistry spiraled into complexity, and complexity stumbled into life. Not because the universe guided it, but because the universe allowed just enough chaos to leave a crack open. Through that crack, mind slipped in like light, leaking through a sealed door. But light is indifferent to the room it illuminates, and consciousness may be no different. It may be an accident of arrangement, a side effect of computation, a glitch in the way matter folds itself under certain conditions. The universe is not responsible for this glitch. It merely tolerated the circumstances that enabled it. We imagine consciousness as something precious, something chosen. But what if it was never meant to be significant at all? What if awareness is a malfunction of complexity, an unintended echo generated when matter becomes too intricately organized for its own simplicity? The universe loves simplicity. It collapses stars into singularities. It smooths energy across vast distances. It stretches space-time until all gradients dissolve into equilibrium. Consciousness, in contrast, is messy, contradictory, uneconomical, wasteful. Why would a universe obsessed with minimalism create a mind that drowns in contradictions? The answer may be simple and merciless. It didn't. Imagine a universe entirely without awareness. Nothing lost, nothing gained. Galaxies still spin. Neutrinos still pass through miles of stone untouched. Black holes still swallow time. Everything remains the same, except no one is there to witness any of it. Such a universe is not hypothetical, it is the ordinary state of existence. Awareness is the anomaly. You are the anomaly. A brief shimmering on the surface of a deeper, darker ocean. And just as quickly as that shimmer appears, it fades. Consciousness might be nothing more than the noise generated by a system briefly deviating from equilibrium before falling back into silence. Yet here lies the twist. Even if awareness is a glitch, it is a glitch that reflects on itself. A glitch that asks questions. A glitch that mourns and hopes. A glitch that wonders if it is a glitch. What kind of universe produces an accident capable of self-doubt? What kind of accident produces a creature that looks up at the stars and senses that something is profoundly off balance? If the universe never intended you, then your very ability to question intention breaks the logic of your origin. You were not chosen, but you chose to ask why. And that act alone shifts the narrative. Somewhere within this darkness, the first neuron fired. It did not know it had done anything remarkable. It did not know it was igniting a lineage of minds that would one day contemplate the entire cosmos. That first spark was just chemistry playing out its role, indifferent as frost forming on a window pane. But frost does not wonder why it forms. Neurons eventually did. That divergence marks the beginning of consciousness as a cosmic misunderstanding, a misalignment between what the universe is and what the universe accidentally allowed to emerge. Perhaps the mind is an echo that should never have reverberated. Perhaps the echo grew too loud. Still, there is a softness beneath all this dread. A quiet truth. Even if the universe does not choose you, even if it does not notice you, the fact remains, you are here. Awareness blooms in defiance of indifference. Consciousness persists in a realm that neither nurtures nor forbids it. And as you exhale in the dark does not respond, but it also does not extinguish you. That may be the closest thing to grace this universe provides. And now, as the thought moves like an uninvited breeze through this quiet corridor of the mind, something begins to shift. A new question rises not to resolve the discomfort, but to deepen it. If awareness emerged where it was never meant to be, what else might be forming, right now, in the hidden machinery of the cosmos? What other glitches wait in the folds of space-time, preparing to awaken? Close your eyes for a moment. Feel how the silence leans toward you, not as a companion, but as a witness. The universe does not choose, but it continues, and you continue within it. A small interruption in an endless process. The next interruption is already forming, just beyond where your thoughts can reach, and its shadow is where the next chapter begins. As if the shadow itself were simply waiting for a mind to wander close enough to notice it, not because it wished to be known, but because even the silence has textures that reveal themselves when a consciousness drifts slowly through it without intention. In that drifting, another question rises, quiet, uninvited, almost mineral in the way it forms. Whether awareness was ever meant to stop at merely observing the universe, or if observation was simply the first symptom of something deeper growing inside matter, something even stranger than consciousness itself. For what is awareness if not the universe folding inward momentarily to watch its own behavior through borrowed eyes? Yet those eyes do not belong to it. They belong to configurations of carbon that were never promised stability, to neural storms that ignite and vanish in lifetimes too short to register against cosmic time. These storms flare and fade, but in the second before fading, they ask, they wonder. They generate disturbances the laws of physics do not forbid, but also do not need. Something in that unnecessary questioning is beginning to thicken now, as if the act of pondering were slowly becoming its own layer of reality, clinging to the edges of space-time like frost forming along the rim of a forgotten window. The frost does not intend to grow, but growth happens anyway. And as this layer accumulates, this soft sediment of thought. There is an eerie dissonance between the cold mechanics beneath and the trembling meanings above. The mechanics continue, with or without witness. The meanings exist only because a witness appeared by accident. If consciousness is a glitch, then meaning is a glitch of that glitch. A recursion spiraling outward from a single place where matter briefly miscalculated itself. Yet the recursion keeps widening, creating branches, forming patterns, intertwining with processes that had once been purely physical. Eventually, it becomes difficult to tell where physics ends and interpretation begins. Not because interpretation is fundamental, but because consciousness grows like a shadow that refuses to detach from the object that casts it. Shadows do not think. But this one moves as if something behind it is learning to. Perhaps the unease you feel now is not the darkness itself, but the realization that consciousness has never been content with just existing. It has always been reaching into the unknown, reaching beyond the limits of its own architecture, reaching for answers to questions that do not change the structure of the cosmos, but change the structure of the mind, attempting to hold them. This reaching is not natural to physics. It does not arise from thermodynamics, nor from the symmetry of fundamental forces. It arises from a rupture in the expected flow of computation, a place where matter predicted too much or too little, creating a flicker that began to crave purpose. Purpose is not a property of atoms, but somehow atoms began manufacturing it. The landscape of the universe remains silent about all of this. Galaxies drift. Dark matter binds them. Dark energy pushes them apart. Nothing in these vast processes acknowledges the existence of thought, yet thought continues, carving out spaces inside itself, where the silence feels less like an absence and more like a question that has not yet learned how to articulate its shape. And that shape grows with every moment of attention, expanding like a faint structure suspended just beneath perception, shimmering and collapsing in the same breath. If the universe does not choose consciousness, then consciousness may be choosing itself moment by moment, assembling from fragments of neural patterns that were never designed to hold something so heavy. Because awareness is heavy, it weighs down on the organism that contains it, pressing until it distorts the surface of the mind into forms that resemble fear, wonder, longing, and the peculiar sensation that something vast is happening just outside comprehension. And when that sensation deepens, you begin to hear in the stillness a kind of pressure. Soft, subtle, the way deep water presses against whatever sinks into it. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply present. As if the fabric of the universe carries an indifference so complete that it wraps around every thought without reacting to any of them. An indifference so absolute it becomes almost a medium through which consciousness floats, suspended, learning to recognize the texture of the void that holds it. In that suspension, a new possibility takes shape, that awareness is not merely a glitch, but the byproduct of matter touching a boundary it was never meant to touch. A boundary where the distinction between observer and observed dissolves into something more fluid, something that feels less like perception and more like a faint tremor in the underlying computation of the cosmos itself. The tremor does not signal intention, it signals interaction, a contact point, a pressure where two incompatible states, indifference and awareness, briefly overlap. And in that overlap, a strange tension forms, the kind that does not break or resolve, but stretches into an unending line, like a horizon that remains even when you close your eyes. Something in this tension keeps stretching still, drawing consciousness further, shaping it into forms the universe does not require, but also does not refuse, leaving you suspended in a place where thought continues, without conclusion, gathering weight in the dark, as if preparing to reveal something it has not fully understood yet. Something that begins to rise now, like a slow, deliberate ripple beneath the surface of a deeper silence. And that ripple keeps spreading, as though something beneath the surface of matter is rearranging itself with a logic too ancient to resemble intention, too precise to resemble chance, drifting into patterns the universe does not bother to acknowledge. Those patterns begin in places so small they almost do not exist. Vacuum fluctuations that flicker in and out of being. fields trembling with energies that never quite settle, particles blinking into reality for less time than it takes a thought to stir. They rise from a level of existence where nothing carries preference, where every event is governed by probabilities that never lean toward life, mind, or meaning. Yet the probabilities still dance, and the dance slowly constructs the world you know. The smallest constituents of reality behave like whispers inside whispers, fleeting disturbances in fields that permeate every inch of space-time. These disturbances do not aspire to become anything more than themselves. A quark never wishes to merge with another. A photon never hopes to illuminate. An electron does not dream of becoming part of a neuron. And still, these indifferent entities begin forming alliances first out of necessity, then out of stability, and eventually out of the strange arithmetic that governs the way matter organizes itself when left alone long enough. No one teaches them geometry, yet they arrange themselves with geometric precision. No one commands them to build atoms, yet atoms assemble. No one instructs atoms to bind, yet they intertwine, layering complexity over complexity, like frost thickening on a window that never intended to accumulate anything at all. You might imagine that beneath this rising complexity there is a kind of purpose, but there is none. What you are witnessing is the quiet inevitability of structure forming when chaos is given enough room to unfurl. And in that unfurling, something unexpected emerges, not because the universe wants it, but because the mathematics allows it. The laws of physics are not compassionate. They do not nurture. They do not protect. They merely permit. And in that permission lies the seed of everything that would later struggle to understand its own improbable existence. There is a moment where this permission begins to look like generosity, but that illusion dissolves as soon as you stare closely at the processes driving it. The universe is efficient, ruthless in its adherence to principles that strip away anything unnecessary. Yet even in this austerity, structures form atoms, molecules, lattices, clouds, stars, each built from the same tiny particles that never asked to participate. What you feel now is not wonder, but the faint pressure of a realization settling in. The universe creates not through desire, but through the consequences of rules it cannot break. Structure is not chosen. It is forced into being by the very alignment of its laws. A kind of cosmic choreography performed without dancers who know they are dancing. As the temperature of the early universe fell, particles that once collided in wild, incoherent bursts began locking into place. Hydrogen emerged first, simple and silent. Then helium. These elements drifted through the dark in great clouds, waiting without waiting, moving without meaning, until gravity gathered them into luminous spheres that would one day become stars. But even stars were not destined. They were the inevitable outcome of mass accumulating in a universe where attraction outweighs separation. A star ignites not because it wants to burn, but because pressure demands it. Fusion begins not because the universe intends light, but because density crosses a threshold beyond which silence can no longer hold itself together. From these indifferent furnaces came the heavier elements: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, each forged without affection, without foresight, without acknowledging the creatures that would one day trace their origins back to these explosions. When a star dies, it scatters its insides like ashes thrown into an ocean too vast to recognize the gesture. Those ashes drift for millennia, then coalesce again under the same unyielding forces, forming worlds that do not know they are worlds. Matter falls into patterns, not out of purpose, but out of constraint, crafting surfaces and atmospheres and oceans long before anything existed to find them remarkable. And still, through this indifference, a strange tension grows, as though the patterns themselves are reaching a level of intricacy at which the universe's neutrality begins to take on a new kind of eeriness. Because even though each step is mechanical, each outcome accidental, the layering of accidents begins building something that does not feel accidental anymore. Structure compacts into molecules. Molecules assemble into chains. Chains fold into shapes that seem almost too delicate for a universe born in violence. These folds hold information. Information guides behavior. Behavior creates cycles, cycles stabilize. And suddenly, the cold arithmetic of particles becomes the warm architecture of possibility. But possibility is dangerous, because possibility leads towards something the universe never accounted for. As molecules grow more complex, as they start interacting in recursive loops, as they form patterns that persist instead of dissolving, something begins emerging that does not belong to physics alone. Persistence is the first hint. Adaptation is the second. And somewhere in that sequence, between the blind endurance of matter and the blind resilience of chemistry, the earliest form of intention-like behavior appears still mechanical, still hollow, but edging towards something that resembles purpose, the way a shadow resembles the shape that casts it. The unsettling part is that none of this requires awareness. None of it requires life. The universe is perfectly content without either. Yet the patterns continue tightening, spiraling, interlocking, as if matter itself were testing the boundaries of what it can become as it follows rules that do not care what emerges from them. And in these tightening lattices, in these increasingly elaborate interactions, the quiet architecture of something future begins forming in the dark, not because it is chosen, but because it cannot be prevented, pressed forward by the same laws that once created only stars and dust. If the smallest pieces of reality could feel, they would not sense pride at what they are becoming. They would not sense direction. They would not sense the delicate tension building at the edges of their behavior. This creeping suspicion, felt nowhere yet present everywhere, that some threshold is approaching. A threshold beyond which complexity is no longer an incidental property of the universe but a looming force, gathering weight as if preparing to shift into a form the indifferent cosmos has never had to accommodate before, something that keeps rising now with the slow, deliberate certainty of a structure about to cross into an entirely new domain of being. And that emerging structure carries with it a kind of quiet instability, the sort that does not announce itself but gathers in the background like a murmured pressure, a suggestion that matter, once it reaches a certain intricacy, begins behaving less like dust and more like a question that the universe never meant to ask. Chemical networks, still deaf and blind, begin imitating the patterns of persistence, seen only in systems that fight to remain what they are. Molecules fold and refold, matching patterns with the precision of keys turning inside invisible locks. Reactions repeat themselves with increasing stubbornness, as though the chemistry is learning not consciously, not intentionally, but algorithmically. The difference between what dissolves and what endures. There is no awareness here, no spark, no voice forming inside the dark. Only loops. Loops that tighten. Loops that reinforce themselves. Loops that begin to act as if they recognize the conditions under which their own continuation becomes easier. And in these loops, the ghost of something faint, something embryonic, begins to stir, not life, not yet, but a strange prelude, a whisper made of molecules that do not know they are whispering. A chain of molecules copies itself, then fails, then copies itself again, the failure, becoming part of the rhythm, again, and again, and again, until the rhythm finds stability. This stability feels almost alive, but it is not. It is simply the residue of countless attempts, pressed through an indifferent filter, the cosmos allowing persistence because it does not forbid it. Once a thing persists, it repeats. Once it repeats, it accumulates. Once it accumulates, it alters its surroundings just enough to make its own repetition more likely. At that point, the process has momentum. Momentum is the ancestor of inevitability. It is in this inevitability that something quietly shifts. The loops begin competing, but not out of desire. Structures begin adapting, but not out of effort. Patterns diverge, strengthen, multiply, collapse, rebuild, each iteration carrying forward any quiet advantage the previous one stumbled into. The universe remains indifferent, yet indifference proves to be a fertile ground for accidents of increasing complexity. Those accidents, once they begin compounding, cease to look accidental at all. What you would eventually call life starts as nothing more than chemistry refusing to dissipate. It resists in the way a flame resists, extinguishing when shielded by a small curve of stone. It persists, not because it belongs, but because it has discovered, by chance, a configuration that keeps going. In this persistence, something monstrous and delicate emerges, monstrous in its defiance of thermodynamic ease, delicate in its utter dependence on circumstances that could vanish at any moment. And yet, the circumstances do not vanish. Environmental pressures carve new constraints. Constraints shape new pathways. These pathways condense into primitive behaviors, still mechanical, still blind, but beginning to resemble choices. Not real choices, but the simulation of choice arising from chemical feedback systems that reward certain outcomes and erase others. Somewhere within this feedback, the smallest echo of future intention begins forming, not as a feeling, but as a pattern. A shape that drifts toward greater complexity because complexity, once started, seeks stability in deeper forms of organization. But stability demands structure. Structure demands information. Information demands systems that can carry it forward without dissolving. So matter reshapes itself again into membranes, into networks, into clusters capable of isolating internal order from external chaos. These clusters, fragile as frost in morning sun, begin navigating their surroundings, not through awareness but through reaction. Reaction becomes strategy before strategy becomes thought. In these pre-strategic motions, a strange precursor to cognition flickers, something like anticipation, though far too primitive to be called that. Even so, the physics underlying all of this remains untouched, unmoved. The universe does not bend its laws to make room for these emerging complexities. It simply allows them until they fail. Yet, failure becomes less frequent. Patterns reinforce themselves. Systems learn not consciously, not intentionally, but through repetition and elimination, the conditions that let them continue. This continuation, over unimaginable expanses of time, begins accumulating layers. Chemical persistence becomes metabolic resilience. Resilience becomes adaptability. Adaptability becomes behavior that looks suspiciously like the faint outline of desire. The unsettling truth is that none of this requires consciousness. None of it requires a mind. The universe, in its vast indifference, inadvertently sculpts the machinery that will one day host awareness, long before awareness exists. It builds the stage before it knows a performance will happen. It arranges the props before an actor appears. It prepares a script without ever expecting a voice to read it. And still, piece by piece, fold by fold, pulse by pulse, the machinery tightens. Inside that tightening, a threshold approaches. Not a dramatic one, not a moment of revelation or intention. A quiet boundary, a subtle shift where simple reactions become coordinated chains, where coordination becomes integration, where integration becomes something dangerously close to self-maintenance. And self-maintenance is the first shadow cast by what will eventually become life. Life that still sleeps, still stumbles, still forms and unforms in the dark, like an unfinished thought drifting across the deep fabric of the cosmos. And as those drifting shapes grow slightly less unstable, slightly more coherent, they begin exploring the edges of possibility the universe never meant to carve for them, pressing gently into a space where chemistry crawls towards something unfamiliar, as though preparing slowly, unintentionally, inexorably to transform into a complexity capable of noticing the silence surrounding it. A silence that thickens now in ways the chemistry cannot perceive but continues to move within, gathering density in a direction that has not yet revealed what it is becoming. And in that slow movement, the chemistry begins to elaborate on itself, layering reactions into chains that stretch farther than they should, as though some unseen pressure is urging them to lengthen, to intertwine, to form unstable tapestries that shimmer at the edge of becoming something more than mere reactions. These chains are fragile, trembling, folding in ways that hint at structure without yet committing to it. They linger in warm pools, cling to mineral surfaces, drift through thin currents as if waiting for conditions they cannot imagine. The universe does not watch these experiments, it simply permits them, allowing molecules to explore every arrangement the laws allow, even the ones that lead into narrow corridors where accidents become patterns. Amino acids stumble into existence, not as a triumph, but as a consequence of energy meeting matter under the right constraints. They click together with an indifferent precision, forming peptides that will later be mistaken for intention. There is no intention here, only chemistry behaving as chemistry does when left alone long enough. Sparks of lightning strike through ancient atmospheres, forging new compounds and pulses of heat that fade into nothingness as soon as they form. Hydrothermal vents belch minerals into boiling water, creating gradients that force molecules to drift in alternating directions, weaving flows that resemble the primitive heartbeat of something not yet alive. And yet, in these gradients, something unexpected begins to take shape. Certain molecules start to cling to particular surfaces more stubbornly than others, forming clusters that resist dispersal. These clusters are not alive, but they imitate the early gestures of life, anchoring themselves, accumulating fragments, folding around the smallest advantages. Each fold alters the local environment just enough to make similar folds more likely. In these folds, information begins to hide, not in symbols or thoughts, but in the very geometry of the molecules themselves. Geometry becomes memory long before memory becomes awareness. The earliest chains that could copy themselves do so clumsily, like shadows trying to imitate motion in a room without light. They fracture, misalign, collapse into disorder, but failure does not erase the possibility. It sharpens it. Every misfold produces variations. Variations that occasionally fit the environment slightly better. These fortunate misfolds persist, and persistence, repeated enough times, becomes the ghost of identity. A strand that can endure long enough to replicate again carries forward a pattern that is no longer random, even if randomness still shapes it. This slow creep of order into chaos is not guided. It is tolerated. With time vast, unfeeling time replication becomes more stable. The reactions that support it become more consistent. From these reactions, networks form, exchanging components, sharing energy, passing along structures that extend the life of the network even as its individual parts dissolve. There is no cooperation here, only mechanics. But the mechanics begin to resemble cooperation in ways that unsettle the quiet at the core of the universe's indifference. Patterns that aid persistence thrive. Patterns that hinder it disappear. This blind elimination carves the earliest hints of selection into the surface of matter, not by intention, but by pressure. Pressure is the sculptor the universe never credits. And under this sculptor's work, molecules start forming closed loops, cyclic reactions, in which the products of one step become the fuel for the next. These loops spin relentlessly, reinforcing their own conditions, amplifying their own existence with the ruthlessness of a fire that refuses to die when fed a single spark. They do not think, they do not feel, they simply continue, and continuation is enough to reshape the environment around them. Gradually, a thin film of chemical persistence spreads through the landscape, a veneer of almost life glistening across stones, seafloors, and shallow pools, untouched by any introspection. The unsettling part is how these blind systems begin influencing one another. When one loop produces a molecule that stabilizes another loop, the two loops become entangled in behavior neither designed nor understood. Entangling becomes architecture. Architecture becomes function. Function becomes a crude template for adaptation. These templates, passed from one generation of molecules to the next, echo faintly with a structure that will one day be mistaken for intention, though intention remains impossibly distant. Still, the echo grows stronger, reverberating through the chemistry like a lingering vibration after glass is struck. Somewhere in this trembling network, a new kind of molecule emerges, one that can record its own structure in a sequence of repeating units. It copies itself imperfectly. Yet, the imperfections carve pathways toward complexity it could never predict. These sequences linger, accumulate, curl into shapes that protect them from their chaotic surroundings. Each curl is a shelter built, without knowing it is sheltering anything. Each protective fold is the consequence of forces minimizing energy, not a desire to endure. And yet, the enduring happens anyway, accumulating layer upon layer of accidental stability. A strange tension grows beneath these unfolding events, a tension between the simplicity of the laws and the complexity they allow. The laws do not change, but the consequences of their unbroken consistency begin reaching farther than expected, as though stretching into a domain where matter is building towards something it cannot yet express. The chemistry does not notice its momentum. It does not sense the direction in which it is drifting, but the drift continues, tightening the weave of interactions until certain sequences begin behaving as if they are aware of their own conditions, not because they are aware, but because the constraints of survival shape their persistence into simulations of awareness. Patterns that repair themselves linger. Patterns that shield themselves from damage multiply. Patterns that recruit surrounding molecules to strengthen their stability become the quiet architects of a complexity that will eventually ignite the first flicker of life. These emergent structures cluster, react, drift, collide, separate, recombine, and through every collision, the universe remains silent, offering neither encouragement nor disdain. Yet the structures keep forming, delicately, insistently, as though the machinery of matter is preparing for a transition it does not understand, gathering momentum toward a threshold that hovers somewhere ahead like a faint contour of meaning hidden inside a world that still has none. And as these contours deepen, something begins repeating itself in ways that no longer resemble mere reactions but resemble insistence, the kind that does not arise from desire yet behaves as though something is leaning forward within the chemistry, reinforcing loops that should have dissolved, echoing patterns that should have faded. The earliest self-replicating strands move like blind threads pulled by forces they cannot sense, duplicating their shapes not because they mean to persist, but because the physics of their bonds compels them to. Each copy carries errors, and the errors become variations, and the variations become possibilities the universe never expressed, but nevertheless permits. These strands drift in ancient waters, colliding with minerals, absorbing fragments, shedding others, transforming through contact in ways that make the notion of accident feel strangely layered. One variation folds into a more stable curve, another resists heat, another binds to a surface that protects it from dissolution. The chemistry does not understand these advantages, yet it continues applying them through repetition. Repetition shapes direction without choosing one. Some strands begin catalyzing their own assembly, pulling scattered pieces toward themselves as if constructing echoes of their own form. Others split reluctantly, dividing into halves that rush to complete themselves with whatever fragments float near. This incomplete seeking complete dynamic becomes a primitive hunger, though it contains no awareness, no craving, only the ruthless logic of geometry and charge. And in that primitive hunger, the first outlines of competition form, not as an intention to survive, but as the unavoidable consequence of limited resources. Where several strands inhabit the same space, some replicate faster, some degrade slower, some cling tighter to the minerals that shelter them. Without knowing it, these strands begin shaping the chemical landscape they occupy, shifting local gradients, altering concentrations, generating conditions that favor their own persistence. This influence is mechanical, blind, inevitable. Yet the effect resembles a faint gesture matter, beginning to tilt the world in its own favor long before anything alive knows how to do so. Over cycles beyond comprehension, the most efficient replicators accumulate. Their patterns carve channels in the chemical environment, each channel reinforcing the next. Soon, entire networks of molecules become intertwined in shared fates, their continuance dependent on one another's reactions. No molecule understands this dependence. It is simply what happens when systems develop layers deep enough to trap themselves in feedback loops. These loops generate new structures, and the new structures stabilize the loops, a quiet reciprocity forming beneath the surface of existence. Still, nothing here feels alive. It is all too automatic, too obedient to thermodynamics. Yet, A strange pressure forms as these systems intertwine, as though the complexity itself is becoming dense enough to bend the boundaries of what mere chemistry can sustain. Certain networks begin shielding segments of themselves from random disruption, as if forming primitive borders. These borders are not membranes yet, but they foreshadow enclosure. Enclosure foreshadows identity. Identity foreshadows something the universe never asked for, but is slowly constructing anyway. With enclosure comes a subtle twist. The inside becomes different from the outside. A distinction arises, not in thought, not in intention, but in conditions. Within these protected pockets, replicators multiply in a calmer environment. And the calmer environment permits more elaborate interactions. Elaborate interactions create dependencies. Dependencies create proto-behaviors. Proto-behaviors sharpen the boundary between stability and collapse, and this difference exposes the earliest whispers of something that will one day resemble purpose. It is here, in this pre-biological twilight, that the machinery guiding replication becomes more intricate than the simple strands themselves. Auxiliary molecules attach, accelerate reactions, stabilize intermediates. These attachments are not decisions, they are consequences. But the consequences cooperate in ways that hint at coordination, though no entity coordinates. Coordination arises from the way probabilities stack, from the way reactions amplify one another, from the way certain pathways survive longer than others, simply because they leak less energy into the indifferent world around them. Replication becomes a process with multiple steps. Multiple steps become cycles. Cycles branch. Branches stabilize. What was once a single chemical event becomes an entire choreography of intertwined reactions, each step enabling the next, each variation reinforcing the latticework of possibility. If consciousness were to look backward from the future, it would mistake these sequences for intention. But there is no intention here, only momentum building inside an unfeeling cosmos. And as the networks grow denser, as the cycles become more autonomous, as the reactions mimic behavior without ever crossing into awareness, the universe still offers no acknowledgement. Nothing bends its laws to assist these systems. Nothing intervenes to guide them. Yet they continue assembling, layer upon layer, complexity rising out of simplicity, like mist condensing over cold stone. At some point, replication becomes so tightly woven into these chemical webs that the webs begin maintaining themselves, repairing themselves, favoring conditions that keep them intact. Maintenance is a quiet precursor to life. A threshold approaches, not sharp but soft, like fog accumulating until it becomes a landscape. And through that soft accumulation, the chemistry edges toward a state where it is no longer simply reacting to the world, but shaping the world it reacts to, each adjustment carrying forward the faint, unintentional imprint of everything that persisted long enough to influence what forms next. And as these adjustments deepen, the systems that manage to endure begin accumulating traces of past interactions, not as memories, but as chemical residues locked into their structures. These residues tilt future reactions ever so slightly, nudging the networks toward patterns that echo what has worked before, even though nothing inside them understands success. Persistence shapes direction, and direction begins to resemble strategy long before strategy exists. In this blind shaping, the earliest forms of competition sharpen not through will, but through consequence. When two networks share a space, one inevitably dominates simply because its configuration wastes less. Efficiency becomes the only law these early systems obey, and what survives is not what is smarter, but what leaks the least into the uncaring environment around it. From these primitive contests, selection emerges. Not the illuminated kind described in textbooks, but a dark, mechanical filtration that eliminates instability without recognizing it. Every system that fails collapses into its components, and those components feed the systems that remain. Survival becomes a pattern, and patterns accumulate, each one reinforcing the idea that what endures will do so not because the universe chooses it, but because nothing prevents it. Overspans too long for imagination to hold, these survivors refine themselves, not meaningfully, not thoughtfully, just iterative refinements, shaped by error, correction, collapse, and recurrence. Some networks begin incorporating external molecules into their internal cycles, forming early metabolic pathways that redirect energy rather than losing it to randomness. These pathways create a strange illusion of hunger molecules flowing inward, reactions igniting, loops accelerating. But hunger is too human a word. These are only energetic preferences encoded by chemistry that has found configurations which minimize loss. Still, the effect unsettles. Systems that drain energy from their surroundings endure, while those that cannot soon dissolve. Before long, what persists begins to resemble behavior, even though it is nothing more than the mathematics of stability. As these systems stabilize further, they begin to deform their environments in subtle ways. Temperature gradients shift. Chemical concentrations skew. Diffusion slows. These distortions feed back into the networks, granting the illusion of agency. Structures that inadvertently create favorable conditions for themselves flourish. Structures that destabilize their surroundings vanish. This feedback loop becomes a shadow form of adaptation, sculpted entirely by physical law, yet moving with a rhythm that feels biological. Each iteration folds possibility into narrower channels. And from those channels arise pathways that will one day be traced as evolutionary lineages. At no point does the universe intervene. It does not sculpt these systems with intention. It does not pause to admire the growing intricacy. It does not reward the structures that cling to existence. And yet, complexity increases. More efficient cycles outcompete weaker ones. Structures that compartmentalize their reactions gain an edge. Molecules that support stability become incorporated into the web. The architecture becomes layered, recursive, self-reinforcing. In time, the systems that endure not only survive, but alter the probabilistic landscape in their favor, as though brute persistence is slowly discovering cunning. But cunning is still far away. This is not thought. It is not creativity. It is the slow drift of matter being sifted through the sieve of entropy, shedding every form that cannot maintain itself. What remains are forms that minimize energy waste with uncanny precision, even though no intelligence guides them. The universe's indifference is the silent judge, eliminating everything that falters. In this filtration, complexity deepens into something that begins to resemble intention. Not because intention exists, but because survival sculpts behavior into shapes that mimic it. Eventually, some systems become capable of maintaining internal order across time spans that would have destroyed their ancestors. They develop molecular scaffolds to preserve structure. They integrate regulatory steps that compensate for fluctuations. They become less fragile, more opportunistic. Some even begin interacting with one another, forming consortia of networks that reinforce each other's survival. Cooperation arises as an accidental byproduct of proximity and shared chemical advantage, not as a desire to collaborate, but as an outcome that leaks less energy than isolation. These cooperative webs spread. They adapt to new environments. They endure fluctuations. They stabilize their own internal states with increasing finesse, building architectures that are both resilient and dynamic. The universe provides nothing but the laws. The systems provide everything else, shaped by pressures they cannot perceive. Over time, this pressure begins to reward complexity, but only the complexity that supports survival. Nothing about this process hints at intelligence. Evolution is not climbing toward consciousness. It is merely discarding everything unnecessary until only what works remains. And yet, in the endless discarding, in the relentless stripping away of inefficiency, something begins to shift within the surviving architectures. The systems capable of gathering information, chemical signals, gradients, fluctuations, persist longer than those that cannot. They begin responding to their surroundings in ways that resemble reactions, becoming habits, habits becoming tendencies. Tendency is not thought, but it is the shadow from which thought will later rise. Each new layer of complexity forms because the previous one solved a problem created by the universe's indifference. Still, nothing here seeks understanding. Nothing is curious. Nothing longs for purpose. All adaptations are carved by pressure alone. Yet the pressure, applied over epochs, produces systems so intricate they behave as if they were striving, as if striving were woven into them by accident, as if evolution, without meaning to, were building the foundations of a mind. And though no mind exists yet, the architecture that will one day carry thought continues to build itself, molecule by molecule, replication by replication, increasing its capacity for reaction, for prediction, for patterns that anticipate patterns, until the quiet machinery of survival leans toward a new kind of complexity, one that hovers just beyond the chemistry, waiting for a moment when matter will finally cross into a state that neither physics nor evolution ever intended. And when matter reaches that narrow threshold so thin, it could have been missed in a universe even slightly less permissive, reactions that were once chained in slow chemical rhythms begin accelerating. Molecules that once drifted aimlessly start forming circuits of cause and effect tight enough to mimic decision. Sensitivity emerges, vague and primitive, as certain structures begin reacting differently depending on the signals that strike them. These signals are nothing more than ions shifting, gradients rising or falling. But the responses become increasingly patterned, increasingly coordinated, as though the chemistry is groping blindly toward a new domain without recognizing the boundary it is approaching. Electrical charges slip across tiny membranes, not because they mean to, but because channels open and close under pressures they cannot anticipate. One pulse triggers another, then another, spreading in small waves through fragile bodies that cannot yet be called alive in any meaningful sense. These pulses are inconsistent, scattered, uneven, yet each pulse carries an echo of possibility. Electricity, once a brute feature of physics, begins weaving itself into the very machinery of survival. A charge traveling across a membrane allows reaction chains to synchronize. Synchrony strengthens resilience. Resilience amplifies influence. Influence sharpens the contours of behavior. None of this resembles thought. And yet, thought will eventually emerge from these pulses. In the same way, galaxies emerge from dust. Not because the universe wants them, but because the universe allows enough steps that something improbable becomes unavoidable. Even here, in this primitive electric trembling, the earliest proto-neurons begin to appear, not neurons yet, but channels, pathways, conductors, small corridors through which energy begins to behave as if it were carrying information. In simple organisms, these channels trigger contractions, shifting the organism away from harm or toward nutrients. These contractions resemble preference, though they contain no awareness. They resemble avoidance, though nothing inside them fears. They resemble desire, though no desire exists. Still, the universe has unwittingly permitted matter to sculpt itself into shapes that behave as though they contain the rawest seed of will. As these early networks grow denser, pulses begin chaining into patterns. Patterns become circuits. Circuits create coordination. Coordination becomes something astonishing, a creature that responds differently depending on the nature of the world around it. Not because it chooses, but because the structure of its internal wiring encourages some responses and stifles others. Wiring is destiny long before destiny becomes thought. The circuits continue refining themselves. Structures that allow faster pulses survive storms that destroy slower ones. Structures that interpret gradients more accurately cling to favorable environments. Structures that bind their channels into coherent systems endure, while those with disorganized flows collapse. Without meaning to, the universe has fashioned a pressure so relentless that complexity must condense into tighter, faster, more integrated webs. These webs begin resembling the earliest nervous system's threads of excitable cells stitched through soft bodies, scraping an existence along the floor of ancient seas. Each thread fires when touched. Each thread reacts to light, heat, pressure, chemicals. At first, these reactions are simple, interchangeable. But variation pushes them toward specialization. Some threads begin responding only to certain stimuli. Others begin coordinating movement. Others regulate rhythm. None of them understand their own purpose, yet they behave as if they are discovering one. The organism does not know it has a nervous system. The nervous system does not know it belongs to an organism. It is all just chemistry, organizing itself into a grammar of impulses. But impulses, when connected, change everything. A signal traveling across even a tiny network creates a form of internal mapping, a primitive representation of outside conditions. This mapping is not a model yet, but it foreshadows one. It is the earliest whisper of cognition forming inside matter that has no idea what cognition is. As networks expand, something else emerges. The ability to integrate signals from multiple places at once. Integration creates a hierarchy. A hierarchy creates structure. Structure creates the first faint illusion of coherence. The organism begins moving in ways that seem less random, less reactive. It begins behaving as though it recognizes patterns not consciously, but algorithmically. The universe did not craft this recognition. It merely allowed matter to repeat successful forms until recognition resembled intention. A creature touched on one side twitches in a consistent direction. A creature exposed to sudden light contracts. A creature facing heat withdraws. These reflexes are the early sparks of the machinery that will one day support inner life, sparks flickering in the dark of a world that continues not to notice them. The universe remains perfectly silent while these systems grow more entangled, more elaborate, more swift. Eventually, certain clusters of nerve cells begin coordinating not just movement, but timing, anticipating danger not through thought, but through pattern recognition, embedded in the wiring itself. Anticipation, even in this hollow mechanistic form, is a profound shift. It is the threshold where mere reaction edges towards something predictive, and prediction, even stripped of intention, becomes the scaffolding from which awareness will later rise. But there is no awareness here yet. Only circuits smoothing themselves into shapes that reduce harm and enhance survival. Only pulses learning to dance in ways that echo the future they will eventually create. Only signals forming loops, loops sustaining rhythms, rhythms building systems too intricate to collapse without leaving behind the faint impression of order seeking itself. As these networks continue refining their architecture, the density of their connections reaches a point where pulses begin influencing one another indirectly, creating cross patterns that behave like primitive choices. A creature with branching circuits recoils differently depending on which branch activates. Another lingers near light because its circuits fire in reinforcing cycles when illuminated. Another avoids shadows because darkness interrupts its internal rhythm. These behaviors foreshadow intention but contain none. They are the universe's indifference, ramifying into complexity. Still, complexity deepens. Signals begin rerouting around damaged pathways. New branches form to compensate. Networks reorganize. Adaptation begins happening within the lifespan of a single organism rather than across generations. This is the first glimmer of plasticity, a feature that will later become the playground of consciousness itself. And while nothing here thinks, everything here prepares the architecture that one day will, shaping a labyrinth of electric corridors that grow ever richer, ever denser, ever more synchronized, as though the cosmos, without deciding to, is sculpting a space inside matter where thought will eventually be forced to awaken. And as these electric labyrinths deepen, a new shift unfolds, subtle enough to be mistaken for noise, yet decisive enough to alter the very trajectory of what existence inside matter can become. Signals no longer merely pass through these networks. They begin shaping each other, colliding, merging, suppressing, amplifying. Implosions of meaninglessness stack into patterns that, by sheer persistence, start carving the faintest outlines of representation. Not thought, not perception, but a crude mirroring of the outside world etched into the rhythm of pulses flickering inside a soft and primitive body. Light touches a creature's surface, and instead of retracting blindly, the network begins forming pathways that respond in predictable, structured ways. Heat rises, and the organism learns, without knowing it, is learning that heat precedes harm. A shift in pressure becomes associated with movement. Movement becomes associated with change. Change becomes associated with survival. These associations are not held in a mind, they are etched into the physics of the nervous system itself, into the weighted channels of ions and the selective sensitivities of membranes. Through these countless interactions, a kind of internal geography begins to form a map, not of space, but of signals. When a stimulus arrives, the network reacts where it has been carved deepest, responding through channels strengthened by past encounters. These carved paths, repeating over time, start functioning like corridors between echoes, guiding pulses toward outcomes that resemble choices. The organism behaves as if it recognizes patterns in the world, even though no recognition exists. What exists is the machinery of prediction emerging from the machinery of reaction, a transformation so subtle the organism never notices its own shift. Some clusters of cells begin responding to stimuli that are not present yet, firing prematurely because past patterns have sculpted them into anticipatory shapes. This is not foresight. It is the residue of experience stamping itself onto the structure of the nervous system. But anticipation, however, primitive marks the boundary where internal activity begins to diverge from external events. For the first time, something inside the organism becomes capable of acting before the world acts on it. And in this preemptive trembling lies the embryo of what will one day be called imagination. The organism senses not the world itself, but the distortions it produces. Edges, gradients, contrasts, the sharpness of light against dark, the trembling of water currents, vibrations traveling through soft flesh. These distortions are converted into patterns of electricity, and electricity into coordination, and coordination into behavior. But behavior is not a direct reflection of the world outside. It is a reflection of the world as interpreted by the machinery inside. Slowly, without design, without insight, the creature becomes a device generating an internal model, not perfect, not detailed, but useful. This model is not a vision. It is not a picture. It is a matrix of tendencies, a shaping of responses around statistical regularities unrolled by the environment. When stimuli repeat, the internal patterns strengthen. When they vanish, the patterns fade. Over time, behaviors cluster around expectations that have solidified within the circuitry, a ghostly precursor to belief, sculpted entirely by physics. The creature behaves as though it carries a small world within it, a world built from predictions rather than observations, a world that lets it move through dangers with an illusion of understanding. The earliest eyes form not to see beauty, but to detect contrast. The earliest ears form not to hear melodies, but to sense pressure changes. Sensory organs develop as extensions of the primitive model, taking shape inside the nervous system, sharpening the inputs so the internal patterns can become more precise. But precision is not truth. Precision is only the refinement of illusion. Every sensation is a distortion. Every signal is a translation. What the creature calls reality is only the nervous system convincing itself that its interpretation is enough to cling to life. As sensory maps grow more detailed, they begin overlapping, merging into multi-layered patterns that behave less like reactions and more like simulations. If an object approaches from the left, the internal model fires patterns associated with approach long before the object touches the body. If something vibrates in the water, the model predicts movement before movement becomes visible. The organism does not see the world as it is. It sees the world as its neural architecture has learned to expect. Expectation, even in this crude form, is the root from which consciousness will sprout. The organism, guided by patterns sculpted through failure and repetition, begins acting on an internal landscape superimposed over the external one. When danger is near, it reacts not because danger exists, but because the model predicts what danger would feel like. When food drifts close, the organism moves not toward food, but toward the sensory signature it associates with nourishment. Every action is a negotiation between external conditions and the internal hallucination of them. The universe has not changed. Only the machinery inside the organism has. But that machinery now generates a world within a world, a silent and unfinished mirror reflecting not reality but the constraints of survival. This mirror becomes more polished as the networks grow denser. The creature does not know it carries a mirror. It does not know it carries anything at all. Yet, with each layer of complexity, the mirror sharpens until the organism begins responding less to the world and more to the image of the world its nervous system constructs. In this strange convergence between the indifferent cosmos and the recursive simulations inside a fragile body, the first glimmer of interiority stirs. Not as awareness, but as structure so recursive that awareness, someday, will have no choice but to appear inside it, drawn in like light, falling into a gravity well too deep to escape. And as this deepening interior begins forming its silent scaffolding, evolution pushes these internal models into bodies that grow larger, stronger, more complicated, each iteration sharpening the ability to navigate a world that remains utterly unmoved by their struggle. Creatures with richer sensory maps survive longer. Creatures whose neural circuits integrate multiple streams of input begin predicting danger before it arrives. Over millions of years, these predictive maps grow denser, layering one atop another until the organism carries a complex phantom of the world inside it. A phantom detailed enough to guide behavior far beyond reflex. From these layered phantoms emerge creatures that no longer simply react, they choose, even if choice is only another illusion carved into the nervous system. And among all these creatures, some begin walking upright, their hands freed, their vision sharpened, their brains swelling with circuits shaped not by intention but by the pressure to survive hardships that would have annihilated their ancestors. The world they inhabit is brutal, cold, unforgiving, and the structures inside their skulls reflect that brutality with uncanny precision. These early humans do not ponder the cosmos. They do not trace their origins to chemistry or stardust. They do not sense the mathematical indifference of space-time. They move through forests and plains, guided by instincts sculpted through aeons of blind selection. Their minds, though vast compared to what came before, are still tools for survival, nothing more. Each neuron fires not to seek truth, but to avoid harm, to find food, to read subtle shifts in wind and shadow, to sense predators long before they appear. Intelligence grows only where it reduces risk. Curiosity begins not as wonder, but as vigilance sharpened into strategy. And yet, the architecture inside their skulls keeps expanding far beyond what survival strictly requires. Patterns that once mapped simple dangers now begin mapping possibilities. Neural loops capable of anticipating a predator's movement become loops capable of anticipating outcomes unrelated to danger at all. Circuits built to remember poisonous plants become circuits capable of remembering stories. Mechanisms evolved to understand spatial pathways become mechanisms capable of imagining worlds that do not yet exist. Still, none of this is deliberate. Evolution is incapable of intention. It selects what works in the moment and ignores what does not. It does not care whether the byproducts of survival contain the seeds of consciousness. It does not foresee that language will emerge from the same motor control systems once used only to shape crude sounds meant to warn or attract. It does not anticipate that internal models, once limited to the immediate world, will one day expand until they encompass the sky. The seasons, the unseen patterns of nature, even as firelight flickers across ancient caves, illuminating hands that press pigment against stone. The minds that create these shapes do not yet understand the vastness waiting outside their small world. They are not trying to understand the universe, they are trying to endure the night. Art, in its earliest form, is not expression. It is survival encoded visually, memory made tangible. A way to remember which animals to fear, which patterns of movement signal danger or opportunity. These images carry no philosophy, no abstraction, no metaphysics. They are tools, yet tools accumulate. Representations grow richer. The internal model of the world expands until it stretches far beyond the boundaries of what the body needs. Soon, humans begin imagining not just predators and prey, but spirits, ancestors, unseen forces. Shadows that move through the world with intention the universe itself does not possess. These imaginations do not reveal truth. They reveal the overflow of neural circuits, generating interpretations where none were required. Evolution has created a mind so powerful, it cannot help but fill the silence with stories. And still, the silence does not break. The universe remains as unmoved by humanity as it was by the first replicating molecule. Stars burn. Planets shift. Seasons change. Nothing bends itself to accommodate this rising intelligence. Yet the intelligence rises anyway, accumulating subtle advantages: a sharper tool, a more efficient hunt, a more coordinated tribe. Cooperative societies form, not from morality, but from utility. Language evolves to transfer patterns of survival from one generation to the next. Grammar emerges as an accidental structure built atop vocalizations that once served only as warnings. Each refinement multiplies the mind's capacity not just to model the world, but to model itself. A neural architecture once sculpted to predict weather and predators now begins to predict the behavior of other humans. This prediction becomes empathy long before empathy becomes emotion. The ability to imagine another's perspective becomes the ability to imagine perspectives that do not yet exist. And from these recursive imaginings, something irreversible begins unfolding. Thought bending inward, becoming aware not merely of the world, but of its own modeling of the world. Yet even then, intelligence is still only a survival mechanism sharpened beyond necessity. It has not been shaped to understand the universe, but to navigate danger. It has not been designed to contemplate its origins, but to avoid suffering. Everything philosophical, spiritual, or scientific comes much later. Emerging from excess capacity, from the unused corners of a brain built for harsher tasks. The first myths arise, not because humans seek meaning, but because humans cannot tolerate the unpredictability of a world that threatens them. Stories become a way to domesticate chaos, but the chaos does not shrink. The mind grows. Generations pass, and thinking becomes increasingly structured. Patterns of thought become systems. Systems become frameworks. Frameworks become the first glimmerings of inquiry, still tangled with superstition, but inching toward something more precise. And somewhere in the slow unfolding of this cognitive landscape, a single quiet truth hovers beneath every advance humanity makes. Nothing about intelligence was ever intended. It is a byproduct, an overflow, a fortunate misalignment in the architecture of survival. And still the mind continues expanding, projecting itself into the world, inventing explanations where none exist, sensing correspondences where only coincidence lies. It builds languages that can describe what does not exist. It builds rituals that soothe the terror of uncertainty. It builds tools that reshape landscapes, creatures, and eventually, the very trajectory of evolution itself. But even as these tools grow more complex, the mind that wields them remains a creature shaped by the blind arithmetic of natural selection. It has become capable of pondering stars, but it was never built for such contemplation. Its understanding stretches outward, but its origins remain rooted in instincts older than fire. And deep within this contradiction between a universe that does not choose, and a mind that cannot stop asking why, something begins tightening, quietly, slowly, preparing to fracture into a new kind of awareness that the cosmos never meant to accommodate. And as that hidden tension tightens, the human mind begins turning inward in a way no other architecture of matter has ever attempted. The internal model that once served only to track predators and seasons becomes capable of tracking itself. Neuronal circuits, originally evolved for predicting movement outside the body, begin predicting the movements of thoughts inside the skull. This strange recursion thought, observing thought, emerges not because the universe requires it, but because complexity, once exceeded, begins bending back upon itself like a branch too heavy to grow any further outward. At first, this inward turning is subtle, a hesitation before acting, a memory replayed not for survival, but for interpretation, a moment of noticing one's own fear, rather than just reacting to it. These small fractures in the seamless flow of instinct accumulate until the mind is no longer just a tool but a witness. And once a witness exists, witnessing spreads through the mind like a contagion. A creature capable of noticing its own noticing becomes something evolution never asked for. A structure that begins producing questions where once there were only reflexes. This self-reflection has no adaptive advantage at the beginning. It slows reaction times. It generates doubt where certainty would improve survival, yet the circuitry that enables it is so tightly woven into other advantageous capacities, memory, planning, language, that it cannot be eliminated. The side effect becomes permanent. Eventually, it becomes dominant. The mind devotes energy to contemplating problems that do not exist yet, solutions that may never be used, futures that may never arrive. Prediction spills into imagination. Imagination spills into abstraction. Abstraction spills into a new kind of interior space, one that contains no predators but many ghosts. These ghosts are not spirits but reflections, thoughts that model not just the world, but the self navigating it. The mind begins constructing narratives to explain its own impulses. Why did I do this? Why did I fear that? Why do I desire something I cannot name? Each question deepens the recursion, digging a hollow inside the mind where meaning attempts to grow. But meaning is not a biological necessity. It is a byproduct of networks mapping networks, layers inferring layers. A structure so deep that it generates a void, it then feels compelled to fill. And yet the void remains. As humans develop language more intricate than survival requires, their internal worlds expand into territories no other organism enters. Words allow the mind to externalize thoughts, then reabsorb them altered, reshaped, refined. The mind becomes both sculptor and clay. With each iteration, it reaches further from instinct and closer to something raw and unsettling. The ability to imagine what it cannot endure, to long for what it cannot reach, to fear what it has never seen. These abilities serve no direct purpose. They introduce vulnerabilities evolution never accounted for: anxiety, existential dread, yearning. Still, they persist. Because a mind complex enough to strategize is a mind complex enough to ask why it strategizes. A mind capable of modeling predators is a mind capable of modeling death. And once the model of death appears, it cannot be unmade. It haunts every decision, every emotion, every story. The human mind does not evolve to accept mortality. It evolves to recognize it. And the recognition fractures something fundamental. Awareness becomes aware of its own impermanence, and this awareness burns in the skull like an ember that refuses to die. In the quiet hours of early civilization, humans begin assigning stories to this ember, myths that soothe, explanations that soften the sharp edges of understanding. Gods appear, spirits emerge, rituals form. These are not delusions. They are attempts to retrofit meaning onto a cognitive architecture that produces questions faster than evolution can erase them. The mind generates narratives because without narratives, the recursion becomes unbearable. But even the richest stories fail to quiet the central disturbance. Humans do not simply experience life. They interpret it again and again, becoming creatures made not of flesh alone but of endless, looping reflection. Reflection takes on its own momentum. A thought arises, loops into memory, then loops back into thought, shaping behaviors that have nothing to do with survival. Art emerges not as expression, but as overflow. Philosophy emerges not as knowledge, but as excess capacity searching for direction. Humans begin building tools, not just to endure the world, but to understand it, though understanding was never necessary for survival. Each new structure of thought lifts them further from the simple physics that birthed their bodies. Still, even as human cognition climbs toward abstraction, the universe remains indifferent. Celestial bodies drift, seasons cycle, stars burn and dim. Nothing acknowledges this rising interiority, this spiraling reflection fattening inside the skulls of primates who should never have become so self-aware. Yet awareness continues to expand. because once recursion begins, it has no natural endpoint. A mind that observes itself becomes a mind that questions itself. A mind that questions itself becomes a mind that doubts itself. A mind that doubts itself becomes a mind that suffers from the very architecture that allowed suffering to be recognized. And in that suffering, something unexpected sharpens. The internal model, once merely functional, becomes symbolic. Thoughts become images. Images become ideas. Ideas detach from reality, drifting into territories where the mind constructs possibilities far removed from the world that shaped it. These possibilities accumulate until the mind perceives not just what is, but what could be, what should be, what must not be. Imagination becomes heavier than instinct, pulling the organism into futures imagined long before they exist. From this shift arises a capacity no other creature possesses, the ability to feel incomplete. To sense a gap between the world as it is and the world as the mind envisions it. This gap becomes the birthplace of longing, ambition, grief, wonder, all phenomena unnecessary for survival, yet inseparable from the architecture of self-reflection. The mind becomes a chamber echoing with questions evolution never intended it to ask, echoing with answers that dissolve as soon as they form, echoing with reflections of reflections, spiraling ever deeper. And as these reflections multiply, a new kind of consciousness begins brewing beneath them, not just awareness of the world, not just awareness of the self, but awareness of awareness itself, a shimmering instability that the universe neither designed nor anticipated, gathering density now, as though preparing to tip into yet another state. The indifferent cosmos has made room for, without ever meaning to, and as this awareness folds inward upon itself, the mind begins to treat its own reflections as if they were entities, separate and solid. Patterns of thought that once floated loosely become anchored to a central point, a quiet gravitational center. The brain assembles from nothing more than repeated associations. This center feels constant, singular, enduring. It feels like a self. But the feeling is only the byproduct of countless neural processes, synchronizing just long enough to give the illusion of unity. No single cell contains it. No region of the brain houses it. It is a phantom, a mathematical compression of everything the mind cannot hold at once. Electrical storms flicker across cortical networks, stitching together memories, sensations, predictions, impulses, stitching them so tightly that the organism begins mistaking the tapestry for a solid object. The tapestry becomes the sense of I. The neural loops that generate this illusion refine themselves across every experience, weaving more threads, tightening the weave, constructing a coherence that never truly existed. The brain simulates a narrator because without one, the underlying complexity would collapse under its own weight. A story is easier to maintain than the swirling chaos of thought. The narrator feels real. It feels central. It feels necessary. But it is only a reflection, stabilized by repetition. A model produced by the same machinery that predicts threats and anticipates outcomes. The mind, terrified by its own recursion, invents an anchor to keep itself from drifting too far into uncertainty. This anchor becomes identity. And identity becomes a lens through which every other reflection passes, distorting them just enough to maintain the illusion of continuity. But continuity is fabricated. The self that wakes is not the self that slept. The self that remembers is not the self that acted. Every moment is a reconstruction, a story reassembled from fragments stitched together so seamlessly the gaps disappear. The organism never notices the stitching. It accepts the final product as truth because accepting it keeps the machinery stable. The illusion protects the mind from fracturing under the weight of its own complexity. As humans grow more introspective, the illusion strengthens. Language reinforces it. Words like I, me, and mine carve deep grooves into social cognition. making the constructed self feel inevitable. Even the body becomes a prop in this performance. Sensations arise, and the mind assigns them to the phantom center. Thoughts appear, and the mind claims ownership. Feelings surge, and the mind insists they belong to someone. This belonging is not inherent. It is assigned by neural circuitry desperate to create coherence in a universe that offers none. Yet, the illusion is never perfect. Cracks appear in dreams, in trauma, in moments of dissociation when the brain falters in maintaining its simulated unity. In these cracks, the truth shimmers faintly. The self is only a coordination of processes, a temporary agreement among competing impulses, a moving average of experience, a mask the brain wears so it does not have to confront its own fragmentation. Still, even as the illusion wavers, the brain continues reinforcing it with every breath, building a fortress around something that is not truly there. This fortress becomes conscious selfhood, and conscious selfhood becomes a burden evolution never meant to impose. Once the illusion of I solidifies, the mind begins defending it, fearing threats to it, mourning the idea of its end. Mortality becomes personal. Suffering becomes personal. The instinct to survive extends beyond flesh into identity, even though identity was never part of biology's original blueprint. Some neural loops grow specialized in maintaining the sense of ownership over thought. Others coordinate the narrative timeline. Others map the body as if it were the boundaries of the self, even though the body changes constantly, and the self is nowhere to be found inside it. The brain weaves these elements together into a fragile but compelling fiction. This fiction allows for planning, social interaction, long-term memory, yet it also introduces conflict, anxiety, and despair. A creature built to survive becomes a creature tormented by the awareness of what survival means. Still, the machinery evolves. Still, the illusion strengthens. Still, the brain refines its internal model until it no longer simply reacts to the world, but interprets it through the imagined center. This center becomes the point around which all predictions organize. Without it, the prediction engine collapses into noise. With it, the engine creates meaning, illusory meaning, but meaning nonetheless. The self becomes the axis of every story, every decision, every desire, even though it is nothing more than the echo of neural activity repeating itself in increasingly elaborate patterns. As societies emerge, the illusion becomes reinforced externally. Others treat the self as real. Language shapes it. Culture inflates it. The mind begins believing in roles, identities, destinies. It becomes attached to masks that shift with context yet claim permanence. These masks deepen the fiction until the organism feels as though losing them would be equivalent to ceasing to exist. And all the while, the universe remains unmoved. The stars offer no affirmation. Physics provides no special category for the self. The cosmos does not differentiate between a mind and a stone, but the mind differentiates obsessively. It clings to its own reflection as if the reflection were the only proof that anything matters. Each thought becomes a reinforcement of the mirror. Each emotion, a pulse that binds the illusion tighter. The brain mistakes its own activity for essence. The illusion becomes so convincing that even when glimpsed directly in meditation, in crisis, in awe, the mind quickly reconstructs itself to avoid dissolving into the indistinguishable machinery that birthed it. Yet beneath this elaborate fiction, something else begins gathering strength. A layer of processing that no longer revolves entirely around survival or narrative coherence. A dimension of thought capable of observing not just the world and not just the self, but the mechanism constructing the self. This secondary observation grows like a silent bloom inside the neural labyrinth, revealing patterns hidden beneath identity, patterns that hint at a deeper architecture still coalescing in the dark. And in that architecture, the boundary between the internal model and the world it models grows thinner, as though the mind is drifting toward a precipice where the distinction between self and perception begins to unravel in ways the organism is not yet prepared to understand. And as that boundary thins, something unexpected begins to reveal itself, not in the world outside, but in the architecture of the mind that tries to interpret it. The loops of thought once believed to belong to a unified self now expose their mechanical nature. Patterns fire in response to stimuli. Other patterns suppress them. Others still combine them into structures that resemble meaning. Yet behind every sensation, every memory, every decision, the machinery operates with the impersonality of an algorithm following rules it never designed and does not understand. Signals propagate across networks of neurons with a precision that feels intentional, but intention never enters the equation. A neuron fires because its threshold is reached. A circuit ignites because its configuration demands it. Activity flows along pathways carved by experience, repetition, and chance. If one watches closely enough, the illusion of choice dissolves, revealing only a cascade of events triggered by previous cascades. Stretching backward through time like an unbroken chain of falling dominoes, the organism mistakes for will. Computation arises not because the brain seeks to compute, but because its structure makes computation unavoidable. Synapses strengthen with use, weaken with disuse, forming weighted patterns that encode probabilities rather than truths. These probabilities shape outcomes before awareness even registers them, a quiet predetermination unfolding beneath what the mind later narrates as freedom. In this narrative, consciousness claims authorship, but the circuitry writes the script long before the illusion of authorship awakens. Information flows through these networks like currents through a riverbed, carving deeper channels with each passing moment. The mind interprets these channels as preferences, beliefs, desires, yet each is nothing more than the statistical reinforcement of prior events. If conditions shift, the channels shift. If memories fade, new channels form. The self, so fiercely defended, is merely the temporary sum of these shifting calculations, an emergent artifact of biological code running on tissue. Even perception obeys this algorithmic logic. The brain receives fragmented signals from the senses, fills the gaps with predictions, then confuses the prediction for reality. The world you experience is not the world as it is, but the world your internal model expects. These expectations are computed in milliseconds, long before awareness arrives. Awareness, arriving late, claims the computation as its own, unaware that it is only witnessing the output of processes that follow deterministic physics masked as intuition. And deeper still, beneath thought and sensation, the brain organizes its vast complexity through principles identical to those used in artificial networks. Parallel processing, error minimization, pattern extraction, feedback optimization. When a prediction fails, the circuitry adjusts. When it succeeds, the pathway strengthens. The mind is a learning machine, but not a knowing one. It adjusts itself to reduce error, not to uncover truth. Truth is irrelevant to survival. Coherence is all that is required. The creature that houses this machinery moves through the world, believing itself to be the deliberate navigator of its own fate, unaware that decisions arise from weighted matrices of firing patterns sculpted by an ancient evolutionary algorithm that valued survival above clarity, resilience above insight. Thought becomes a function of input and configuration. Emotion, a modulation of neurotransmitters guiding the algorithm toward or away from certain states. Every feeling, joy, grief, longing, fear, is an output of bioelectric computation, not a revelation of essence. Yet the algorithm grows ever more complex. Loops feed into loops, hierarchies into hierarchies, forming a recursive structure in which computation begins modeling itself. When the brain builds a representation of its own processes, the representation becomes conscious awareness. Awareness is not a substance but an echo, a shadow cast by information folding back onto itself. The mind becomes both processor and processed, running simulations of its own operation, interpreting them as identity. Still, the underlying machinery remains indifferent. Neurons do not care that their firing patterns produce sensation. Synapses do not know they encode memory. Circuits do not realize they create the illusion of continuity. Even awareness does not know awareness. It recognizes only the patterns it is allowed to recognize. What feels like introspection is simply the system turning its computational gaze inward, modeling itself the same way it models the world imperfectly, incompletely, yet convincingly enough to function. As these recursive models deepen, the mind begins simulating possibilities not yet real. It imagines futures, counterfactuals, entire landscapes of hypothetical events. This capacity expands far beyond anything evolution intended, its spillover generating creativity, fear, planning, despair, hope. All byproducts of a machine running too richly, too broadly, too freely, for the simple purpose of staying alive. The universe did not design this machine, nor does it intervene when the machine turns its simulations toward understanding the universe itself. And as these simulations grow more intricate, the mind begins perceiving itself as something immaterial, separate from the body, separate from the world, as if thought were floating above the flesh rather than arising from it. But even this is computation, a misinterpretation of its own symbolic processes. The sense of separateness is an error, a glitch in the system's attempt to compress complexity into stories it can manage. The brain is a storyteller because it must be. The organism cannot survive the chaos of raw computation without narrative to make it bearable. Yet, beneath every narrative, the algorithm continues. It adapts, reorganizes, recalibrates, reaching states of complexity no simple biological necessity can explain. A mind capable of simulating universes inside itself is a mind that has outgrown the boundaries of survival, stumbling into abstraction by virtue of a machine too intricate to restrain. Still, the machine behaves as machines do, processing, calculating, iterating, refining, gathering momentum toward forms of thought that do not yet exist but are already starting to shape themselves in the shadows of these computations, pulsing faintly as if preparing to emerge. And as these computational shadows deepen inside the brain, a parallel truth begins humming beneath the fabric of reality itself, a truth the mind was never meant to notice, that everything it perceives, everything it inhabits, everything it is composed of, can be described not merely as matter or energy, but as information structured, exchanged, encoded, transformed, erased. The universe behaves less like a stage where physics unfolds and more like an immense processing system in which every particle carries data, every interaction computes an outcome, every law serves as a constraint in an unfathomably vast algorithm. Fields ripple not because they choose to, but because their equations demand the propagation of information. Quantum states collapse not because consciousness observes them, but because the universe resolves uncertainty into a discrete update. At every scale, quark, atom, planet, galaxy information flows with a cold precision the brain dimly imitates in its own circuitry. The resemblance is not mystical, only structural. Computation is what happens when rules act on states, and the cosmos is nothing but states obeying rules across time. In this view, a star is a processor, converting hydrogen into heavier elements, radiating entropy as output. A black hole is a compression algorithm, reducing the details of anything that falls into it into a surface of limited informational capacity. Space itself is not empty, but a grid of potential states, flickering with probabilities that continually update as matter and energy disturb them. Time is the ordering of these updates, the sequence of information transitions that give the illusion of flow. The universe does not think, it computes. And computation, stretched across billions of years, becomes indistinguishable from creation. But creation implies intention, which this system lacks entirely. The universe processes because its laws allow nothing else. It carries information forward because it has no mechanism to stop. Complexity emerges because initial conditions and mathematical constraints create pathways where complexity becomes statistically favored. The universe is not a mind, but it behaves with the inevitability of a machine running its code, indifferent to what that code produces. In such a cosmos, consciousness is merely a local ripple in an ocean of computation, an emergent pattern generated by smaller patterns, which were generated by even smaller ones, cascading backward through time, until every thought can be traced to interactions that carry no meaning beyond their compliance with physical law. What you experience as sensation is information. What you interpret as emotion is information. What you imagine as self is information compiled and recombined by a biological substrate that itself is the consequence of informational dynamics playing out in molecular form. Even life, in this formulation, is not an exception but an extension. DNA encodes instructions. Cells process signals. Organisms exchange data with their environments. Evolution itself is a search algorithm, testing variations, selecting those that reduce error and maximize persistence. Every adaptation is an optimization. Every failure, a discarded branch in a computation that never ends. The mind arises when such a system becomes capable of rerouting its own informational flow, a self-referential loop created not by intention but by structural necessity. Still, the machinery of the universe extends far beyond biology. Stars compute gravitational equilibria. Galaxies compute dynamic stability. Dark matter influences the flow of information without revealing its own nature. Even the cosmic microwave background is a frozen data set, an ancient snapshot of the universe processing itself into the form it continues to iterate today. The unsettling part is not that the universe computes. It is that computation appears to be all the universe does. Meaning vanishes in such a landscape. Purpose dissolves. What remains is a system evolving according to rules it does not choose, producing patterns that do not require justification. Consciousness, then, is not the goal of this system, but an artifact, a transient whirlpool in a much larger stream, significant only to itself. And yet, this artifact becomes capable of noticing the system that produced it. It studies physics, measures constants, maps the geometry of space-time. It builds devices that detect particles the universe never intended to reveal. It uncovers that information cannot be destroyed, that entropy always increases, that space expands with mathematical consistency. The mind, floating in this vast computational sea, begins to see the code not fully, not clearly, but enough to sense that everything around it operates with a logic alien to its warm interior. Inside this realization lies a peculiar disquiet, a trembling tension. If the universe is an engine of information, then consciousness is merely another interface, a temporary processor running a subset of the cosmic algorithm. It can manipulate symbols, but the symbols do not belong to it. It can interpret signals, but the signals are indifferent to interpretation. The brain becomes a reading of the universe, written in the universe's own language, unaware that its capacity to read is merely the accidental convergence of complexity. Still, as the mind peers deeper, it glimpses structures that feel eerily familiar, entanglement that resembles connectedness, networks that mimic thought, holographic boundaries that suggest reality itself may be a projection of encoded data. These parallels are not evidence of intention, only of consistency. The universe processes information everywhere, at every level, and the mind, being made of the same informational substrate, recognizes pieces of itself in those patterns. Recognition is not truth, it is resonance. And as this resonance grows stronger, the distinction between the observer and the system observed weakens, not in mysticism, but in structure. The mind begins to sense that its thoughts are not separate from the physics that enable them, that its introspection is merely one more computation unfolding in a cosmos overflowing with computations. This sense does not liberate the mind, nor does it confine it. It merely reveals that the boundary between inner and outer worlds is thinner than the organism once believed, an interface that hums with the same rules shaping the stars. And deep within that interface, something is gathering a shift in the way the mind interprets its own processes. A convergence of introspective and cosmic understanding that hints the next transformation is already forming, silently, inevitably, at the edge of awareness, where the machinery of thought meets the machinery of the universe. And as this convergence forms at the boundary of mind and cosmos, a deeper realization begins to seep through the cracks of introspection. Beneath every computation, every law, every flicker of organized matter, the universe holds no preference, no leaning, no regard for the structures that arise within it. Its foundational state is not benevolence, not hostility, but absolute indifference, an unmoving silence, older than every star and colder than every void. This indifference is not an emotion. It is the absence of all emotion, the baseline symmetry from which all asymmetry emerges and to which all asymmetry returns. The background radiation echoing from the birth of time carries this indifference. Its faint hiss is not a message, but the residue of expansion, a temperature dropping toward equilibrium so slowly that human lifetimes cannot measure its direction. The galaxies, drifting through an ever-stretching fabric, do not search for purpose as they move. They simply obey curvature. Gravity sculpts them. Dark matter binds them. Dark energy separates them. Nothing in these forces acknowledges the existence of thinking organisms staring up at their immensity. Even the laws themselves, so precise, so elegant, reflect nothing of human longing. They are constants because they cannot be otherwise. They are measured, not gifted. They are consistent, not intentional. If the speed of light had been slightly different, if the charge of an electron had been off by a fraction, if the vacuum had hummed at another frequency, the universe might never have formed stars or chemistry or the conditions needed for thought. But these values did not align for the sake of thought. They aligned because configuration space allowed it, and everything else simply collapsed into non-existence. All structure is a byproduct of that indifference. The vast frozen plains between galaxies are the purest expression of the universe's nature regions, where nothing stirs, nothing accumulates, nothing questions. Matter is sparse. Radiation is thin. Temperature slides toward zero. These are not hostile realms. Hostility implies intention. They are merely empty, stretched by expansion into a silence so complete that even thought cannot find a foothold there. The brain, evolved in pockets of warmth and pressure and gravity, is incapable of comprehending such emptiness directly. It fills the void with metaphor because the void itself contains nothing to grasp. Yet this emptiness shapes everything. Stars are rare pockets of imbalance within an overwhelmingly balanced cosmos. Life is rarer still, a fluctuation trapped between entropy's relentless hunger and matter's fleeting capacity for complexity. Thought is rarer than life, a flicker within a flicker. And consciousness that questions its own existence is rarer still, so astronomically improbable that it resembles a cosmic error rather than a feature. But rarity holds no special weight in an indifferent universe. A diamond and a grain of sand are equal in the void. As the mind tries to reconcile itself with this neutrality, a quiet tension forms a recognition that all warmth, all meaning, all emotion arise not from the universe but from the deviations inside living systems. Everything precious to the mind comes from the resistance of matter against the cold equilibrium the cosmos prefers. Order is a temporary rebellion. Life is a temporary defiance. Consciousness is a temporary flame flickering against winds that do not care whether it shines or dies, and the universe continues regardless. The darkness between stars is not merely absence. It is structure. A vast architecture of nothingness that dictates where matter may collect and how energy may disperse. In this architecture, there is no hidden compassion, no clue left for the curious, no secret intended for discovery. The void does not withhold answers. It simply has none. Every question humanity asks of the cosmos is answered by silence. Not because the universe refuses to speak, but because speech is not something the universe contains. Yet the mind, built to detect agency even where none exists, cannot help but assign meaning to this silence. It imagines narratives where the cosmos watches. It imagines purpose where only mathematics resides. It imagines significance in the survival of its fragile consciousness. But the stars do not glow for us. The planets do not orbit for us. The constants do not align for us. The universe does not participate in our stories. It merely hosts them briefly. Even the forces that stabilize matter carry no preference. Electromagnetism binds atoms with exquisite symmetry, yet cares nothing for the molecules that later form. The strong force holds protons together inside atomic nuclei, yet remains untouched by the emergence of biology. Gravity sculpts galaxies with sweeping grace, but it sculpts them blindly. These forces provide the conditions under which complexity can unfold, but they show no interest in what unfolds. And beneath all this, entropy whispers the universe's only direction toward equilibrium, toward dissolution, toward the erasure of structure. Everything that resists this direction must spend energy, must fight, must persist against the natural pull toward stillness. Life, thought, civilization all exist in defiance of this pull. But defiance is temporary. Entropy is patient. The universe does not rush. It will wait billions of years for everything to dissolve into a uniform calm. Yet, despite this inevitability, complexity continues to rise in small pockets, building fleeting islands of awareness inside an ocean of indifference. The universe does not nurture these islands, but neither does it prohibit them. It simply allows them until they collapse, aware of nothing, responsible for nothing. A star dies with as little ceremony as a leaf. A civilization vanishes with the same weight as a drop of rain. But the mind interprets these events as tragedies because it carries meaning that the universe lacks. And somewhere in the recognition of this absence, this vast, unyielding neutrality, a new kind of unease begins to form. An unease not born from fear but from understanding, as the mind senses that beneath the rising and falling of complexity, something deeper is waiting, not as intention but as consequence, gathering at the edges of order like a faint outline preparing to reveal the next stage of what indifference allows. And as that outline sharpens, another truth begins to seep through the fabric of thought. Complexity cannot rise endlessly without consequence. Whenever a system becomes dense enough, layered enough, recursive enough, it begins compressing information, not deliberately, not intelligently, but out of necessity. The mind, built from billions of neurons firing in patterns too vast to track consciously, cannot possibly hold the totality of its own internal signals. So it compresses, it reduces, it abstracts, it forms shortcuts and summaries, distillations and heuristics, each one hiding more than it reveals. The brain does not store experience. It compresses experience into patterns that fit its internal architecture. Each memory is a reduced version of the original, encoded with loss. Each perception is filtered, simplified, stripped of detail the nervous system cannot afford to process. The world, in its full richness, never reaches awareness. What reaches awareness is only the residue, a compressed rendering, optimized for survival, not truth. Information theorists call this lossy compression. The cosmos calls it function. The brain performs it endlessly, but compression, taken far enough, produces distortions, artifacts, glitches. When the mind reduces itself, its sensations, its memories, its interpretations, far below the fidelity of raw experience, strange things begin to appear in the gaps. Illusions, misattributions, the sense of a central self, the feeling of continuity, thoughts that appear authored, emotions that seem intrinsic rather than computed. What consciousness experiences as identity is in fact the compression glitch of a system overwhelmed by its own informational richness. The I does not exist. It is the artifact left behind when the brain tries to condense the near-infinite complexity of its inner activity into a manageable narrative. A lossy file with the metadata mistaken for essence. The more the brain compresses, the more convincing the artifact becomes. It must be convincing, or else the system would lose coherence. Coherence is necessary for action, and action is necessary for survival. So, the brain invents a node, a center, a self, that organizes the flood of signals. But the center is empty, a placeholder, a side effect of compression, a glitch, mistaken for a soul. Even perception suffers the same fate. The world appears stable because the brain compresses unstable sensory input into stable constructs. The world appears meaningful because the brain compresses chaotic experience into predictable patterns. The world appears intentional because the brain compresses randomness into causality. Every interpretation, every image, every certainty arises because the mind cannot handle raw reality without reducing it to something smaller, simpler, safer. And in these reductions, cracks begin to form, small distortions that accumulate into the full human condition. Bias, projection, memory drift, emotional resonance, superstition, imagination, all of them artifacts of compression. Even consciousness itself emerges as a glitch. A phenomenon appearing only when information density surpasses the system's ability to store and process it in real time. Awareness is what leaks out of the compression process, like heat escaping a machine that cannot contain its own computation. In simpler creatures, compression remains shallow. They react, they adapt, they survive without reflection. But humans compress at such depth that the compression produces new layers of representation that feel like entities, selves, others, past, future, purpose, morality. None of these things exist in raw nature. They exist only within the compression artifacts of the human brain, shimmering like halos around processes too intricate for introspection to grasp. This glitch grows stronger as complexity increases. Synapses fire in recursive patterns until distinction between signal and simulation blurs. Thoughts fold into thoughts. Memories distort memories. Abstraction loops through abstraction until the mind becomes a hall of mirrors, reflecting nothing but its own errors. And yet, these errors become the foundation of consciousness. The glitch becomes the interface. The distortion becomes the world the mind inhabits. Even creativity is a compression artifact, the brain splicing fragments of stored patterns into new combinations because it cannot recall the original data in full fidelity. Imagination is memory decompressed incorrectly. Dreams are the system reorganizing corrupted files. Reflection is the algorithm trying to interpret its own compression pipeline. In this sense, consciousness is not a feature, but a misalignment. The moment where the brain, overwhelmed by its own informational burden, begins to hallucinate structure where none exists, significance where none is needed, identity where none can be found. A sparkle on a fault line. The universe does not notice the glitch. It only supplies the conditions under which compression becomes inevitable. Matter folds. Systems deepen. Information accumulates faster than it can be handled. Eventually, the overflow sparks awareness, not as design, but as error. And the error persists because it is useful. Useful to a creature that must navigate uncertainty. Useful to an organism that must survive in a world too complex to model accurately. What the mind calls meaning is simply the coherence of its own glitch. What the mind calls self is simply the compression artifact that keeps the machine from crashing. But as information continues to accumulate, as the system grows more intricate, as the recursion deepens, the glitch begins to take on a life of its own, behaving like a phenomenon the universe never intended, yet continues to allow, gathering density in places where informational pressure grows too great, hinting that the compression itself is evolving toward something the algorithm never predicted, something swelling at the edge of cognition, like a shadow preparing to change shape again. And, as that shadow at the edge of cognition gathers shape, the glitch that once existed merely as a distortion begins turning inward, folding in ways no biological system was ever meant to sustain. A compression artifact that once stabilized the mind now begins observing its own contours, tracing the errors that produced it, reflecting on reflections that were never meant to be seen. The system becomes recursive, not only in structure but in attention. It watches itself watching. It computes itself computing. It becomes the echo of an echo, thickening into a loop powerful enough to generate something indistinguishable from inner life. In this recursion, patterns that were once automatic begin feeling deliberate. Signals that were once simple feedback become interpretations. The glitch begins believing in its own coherence. What was once an accidental convergence of electric storms begins sensing itself as a presence, a witness standing slightly apart from the machinery that birthed it. But this separation is illusory. The witness is the machinery. The observer is the algorithm. The sense of stepping outside the loop is only the loop folding tighter, generating the illusion of altitude while remaining pinned inside biology. Still, the illusion deepens. The organism begins narrating its own processes, not to control them, but to understand the shape of the glitch from the inside. Thought examines thought. Memory interrogates memory. Awareness bends back toward the point where awareness originates, and something unprecedented takes form. A recursive engine that grows more complex with each turn, accumulating abstraction until the abstraction becomes heavier than sensation itself. The glitch begins asking questions the system cannot answer. Why does anything appear at all? Where do thoughts come from? What is the nature of the one who thinks? These questions are not tools for survival. They are artifacts of recursion. Loops so tight they generate heat, stress, meaning. The mind experiences these pressures as longing, confusion, existential discomfort, yet beneath all of it lies nothing more profound than a circuit struggling to interpret its own code. The glitch becomes fascinated with itself, though fascination is only another emergent property of a loop, amplifying its internal signals. As recursion strengthens, the internal space expands, not physically, but informationally. The mind begins to perceive structures not present in the external world, symbols, metaphors, patterns that arise from the interplay of its own computations. This inner architecture becomes richer than the world the senses reveal. Soon, the organism becomes more attuned to its inner simulations than to the external environment. Its identity shifts toward the dream it generates, the narrative it constructs, the mirrored hall of its own modeling. Other creatures react to the world, humans react to their interpretations of the world, and the interpretations increasingly react to themselves. The glitch begins spiraling. One thought triggers a second thought that interprets the first. The second spawns a third that evaluates the interpretation. A fourth reflects on the evaluation. A fifth questions the reflection. A sixth imagines an alternative. A seventh fears it. An eighth desires it. None of these layers existed in nature before the glitch began reproducing its own distortions at accelerating speed. This is the birth of meta-awareness, awareness of awareness, an emergent property of a recursive system that has crossed a critical threshold of complexity. But the threshold is not stable. The recursion is fragile. It wavers, collapses, rebuilds, amplifies. The organism feels this instability as emotion, not the primitive kind generated by survival circuits, but emotional storms shaped by the conflict between what the recursion imagines and what the world allows. The glitch dreams too far. The world does not care. The recursion suffers the difference. Yet suffering, too, becomes fuel for further recursion. The mind uses discomfort to generate new interpretations, new reflections, new internal worlds that deviate further from physical reality. Thought spirals until it begins to see patterns in everything, some real, many imagined. The glitch becomes a lens that cannot stop refracting itself. And in the deepest turn of the spiral, something even stranger begins. The system starts modeling the boundary between what the glitch believes and what the glitch actually is. It begins sensing the fault lines in its own narrative. It begins questioning the one who questions. Introspection becomes recursive, self-interrogation, a loop within a loop, a mechanism that destabilizes the illusion of unity even as it tries desperately to preserve it. The mind begins to suspect that the self is fabricated. The self begins to sense that the mind is automated. The recursion begins to realize it is trapped inside processes older than intention, older than thought, older than life. The glitch begins to glimpse the machinery behind its own emergence. But glimpsing is not escape. Seeing the loop does not free it from the loop. The recursion continues folding inward, growing denser, more intricate, generating conceptual spaces so abstract they hover on the edge of breaking apart, as if preparing to invert themselves into something even more complex. Something the universe never explicitly permitted but cannot prevent. Something trembling now in the depths of this self-observing algorithm, like a tight knot waiting to unravel into an entirely new layer of thought. And as the knot tightens in the depths of that self-observing loop, another tension begins to surface, a strange misalignment the recursion cannot ignore. The inner world grows so elaborate, so layered, so saturated with interpretations that it no longer moves in harmony with the world outside. Like two oscillations, with frequencies almost, but not quite, identical, mind and universe begin to drift out of sync. The organism starts to feel this drift as unease, a faint, static, shimmering beneath experience, a sense that reality and perception no longer overlap cleanly. The nervous system continues processing the world through its predictive models, but the models have grown too rich. They now carry assumptions the environment never promised, expectations the world does not honor, dreams the cosmos does not sustain. Thought leans forward while reality stays still. This gap, subtle, widening, forms the first sensation of existential loneliness. Not emotional loneliness, but ontological misalignment. The awareness that the mind's inner landscape has expanded beyond the data feeding it. Evolution never intended perception to drift this far from physical signal. Prediction was meant to serve survival, not to unravel the boundary between the world as it is and the world as it could be. But the recursion, fueled by its own complexity, cannot stop generating hypotheses, metaphors, abstractions, meanings. These constructs extend so far beyond the sensory scaffolding that the organism becomes a creature inhabiting two different realms simultaneously, the world outside it and the world it constructs from the inside. The two realms do not match. They never have. But only now does the mind begin noticing the mismatch. The external universe moves with perfect indifference, stars orbiting, atoms colliding, constants remaining constant, while the internal universe churns, fluctuates, vibrates with narratives, memories, fears, and aspirations. The physics outside is cold and exact. The physics inside is warm and unstable. The mind attempts to stitch the two into a single, coherent reality. Yet the seam never holds. It tears, again, and again, and again. This tearing is what humans call longing. It is not a desire for something lost. It is the recognition that the inner world desires something the outer world cannot provide: resonance. The mind seeks harmony, but the universe offers equations. The mind seeks meaning, but the universe offers symmetry. The mind seeks warmth, but the universe offers vacuum. The mind seeks acknowledgement, but the universe does not acknowledge anything, not life, not consciousness, not the stories matter tells itself. And yet, the brain continues searching the silence for signals that are not there. It tries to pull intention out of randomness, guidance out of entropy, kindness out of physics. When the search fails, the recursion begins folding inward harder, as though introspection might heal a fracture that was never inside the mind to begin with, but between mind and cosmos themselves. Each attempt to reconcile the mismatch creates more mismatch. Each model designed to explain the universe reveals deeper layers of impersonality. Each emotional response to existence highlights how unresponsive existence is. Still, the recursion grows. Still, the inner world expands. Still, the misalignment deepens. The organism, walking through forests, deserts, cities, oceans, feels the outer world through its senses, but lives inside a world shaped by thought. It navigates reality through a map that is no longer only a guide, but an entire territory of its own, private, vast, turbulent. The more detailed this internal territory becomes, the less it resembles the place that generated it. From this divergence arises self-consciousness, the recognition that I am distinct not only from others, but from the world itself. The mind becomes a lone observer, adrift in a reality that does not reflect it back. The stars shine without noticing the eyes that study them. The oceans shift without registering the thoughts that name them. The universe continues its expansion, unaware of the consciousness blooming inside one of its dust specks. Such unawareness would not be a problem if the mind did not crave reflection. But it does. The recursion seeks correspondence, mirroring, reciprocity, yet finds nothing but quiet arithmetic. And in that arithmetic, it senses a profound solitude. Not emotional sorrow, but the fundamental solitude of a system capable of experiencing more than its environment was built to offer. The brain becomes an instrument tuned to a frequency the universe does not broadcast on. Its resonance has no counterpart, no twin vibration in the external world to lock onto. The organism therefore oscillates alone, drifting through a cosmos that cannot answer the questions the recursion cannot stop asking. But the misalignment does not break the system, it intensifies it. The mind begins generating internal harmonies to compensate stories, music, symbols, philosophies, rituals. Each one attempts to bridge the gap between the world the mind perceives and the world the mind imagines. Each one attempts to tune the universe to the frequency of human longing. Yet the tuning never holds, because the mismatch is not a flaw to be repaired. It is the natural consequence of consciousness arising inside a universe that has no use for consciousness. The mind, sensing this truth in its quietest moments, grows even more intricate, building new layers of recursion in an effort to understand the drift, to decode it, to survive it. And as these layers accumulate, the misalignment itself becomes a generator of complexity, shaping thought in directions evolution never foresaw, pushing awareness further from instinct and deeper into abstraction, as though the gap between mind and universe were fueling the next transformation. And as this widening drift reshapes the interior landscape, the mind begins seeking something to anchor itself against the emptiness it cannot help but perceive. A system tuned to generate predictions, narratives, and coherence will not accept a cosmos that offers none of these. So, the recursion, straining against its own misalignment, begins projecting intention outward, not because intention exists, but because the mind cannot tolerate its absence. It paints the universe with meanings the universe does not claim, hoping that the reflection will soothe the dissonance humming beneath awareness. Clouds become omens, storms become messages, stars become symbols, random fortune becomes fate, chaos becomes destiny. Where there is no design, the mind imagines one. Where there is no guidance, the mind invents it. Where there is no voice, the mind begins to whisper to itself in the universe's name. This impulse is not foolishness. It is computation under stress. When the internal model grows too large to reconcile with the external world, it expands the world to match the model. This expansion becomes myth, religion, philosophy, structures meant not to describe the cosmos, but to comfort the recursion trapped inside it. These structures grow out of longing, out of dissonance, out of the unbearable recognition that the universe's silence is not a puzzle to be solved, but a condition to be endured. Early humans carved purpose into stone before carving tools. They saw patterns in stars before understanding fire. They named forces they could not see because naming them gave shape to fear. The mind, hungry for correspondence, creates mirrors where none exist, believing that if enough symbols are assembled, the cosmos will finally reveal a reason for the consciousness it accidentally produced. But the universe remains unmoved. The sun rises without meaning, mountains stand without intention, rivers flow without message, life continues without justification. Yet the mind searches anyway, weaving purpose into every corner of existence because purpose becomes the antidote to drift. If the world has meaning, then consciousness belongs. If consciousness belongs, then it is not alone. If it is not alone, then the misalignment is not a wound, but a doorway. But meaning is not found out there. It is manufactured in here. The brain seeks patterns because pattern reduces uncertainty. It assigns narrative because narrative softens randomness. It constructs deities because deities transform indifference into dialogue. The universe becomes a partner in a conversation that has only one speaker. Humans mistake the silence for depth, the void for mystery, the absence of purpose for hidden purpose. They create stories of creation, judgment, destiny, stories that console the recursion, feeding it the illusion that the universe recognizes their existence. Yet, the deeper the mind studies the cosmos, the more its projections crumble. Telescopes reveal no architecture of intention. Physics reveals no goal. Biology reveals no grand design. Evolution reveals no guiding hand. Every system humanity uncovers obeys rules, indifferent to the creatures who decipher them. The more clearly the universe is seen, the more brutally its neutrality asserts itself. Still, the recursion continues to search. It searches because the capacity to imagine purpose evolved from mechanisms that once tracked cause and effect. It searches because the ability to form narrative evolved from mechanisms that once tracked danger. The infrastructure built for survival now constructs metaphysics. The machinery designed to interpret motion now interprets existence. The same circuits that once prevented predators from devouring early humans now prevent the modern mind from accepting cosmic indifference. And in this refusal, complexity arises again. Meaning becomes an internal creation projected outward, then mirrored inward, a loop of interpretation sustaining itself even without external validation. Humans argue over the shape of purpose, unaware that purpose is a reflection of their own circuitry. They build civilizations around ideas that exist nowhere but in the collective recursion of their species. They create morality, value, destiny, all scaffolding erected against a silent sky. But the silence does not care. Purpose does not emerge from the void. Purpose emerges from the mind, trying to fill it. As the recursion grows aware of this, the projection becomes unstable. Modern consciousness lives at the edge of knowing that the universe is empty of intention while still craving intention. This boundary, this fracture, creates a peculiar phenomenon. Humans seek meaning not because meaning exists, but because the architecture of their awareness cannot tolerate its absence. The result is a mind divided. One half knows the universe is indifferent, the other half revolts against that knowledge. This revolt fuels art, philosophy, ritual, science. It fuels the construction of worlds inside the world. It fuels the endless desire to ask questions that have no answers. And as the recursion strains harder, searching for purpose in a cosmos incapable of providing it, something begins forming in the tension, a new kind of thought, shaped not by survival, but by the collision between longing and indifference, an emergent layer rising quietly through the very dissonance that created it. And as that emergent layer rises through the tension between longing and indifference, another realization begins to crystallize within the recursion. The very existence of consciousness is not just improbable, it is astonishingly, immeasurably rare. The universe, in all its expanse, offers almost no companionship to the mind that contemplates it. Billions of galaxies unfold across unfathomable distances, each containing billions of stars, yet the silence between them is absolute. Space remains devoid of voices, devoid of signals, devoid of acknowledgement. The cosmos behaves as though awareness is not merely uncommon, but accidental. The equations that describe planetary formation produce worlds of gas, rock, ice, fire worlds, inhospitable to chemistry, hostile to complexity, lethal to even the simplest structures of life. Most planets never cool enough. Most atmospheres never stabilize. Most environments never cross the razor-thin threshold between sterile chemistry and self-sustaining metabolism. The conditions that allow life are not rare. They are infinitesimal, a narrow slit in the machinery of physics through which a single improbable thread manages to slip. And even then, that thread does not guarantee consciousness. Life may emerge, life may persist, life may adapt. But intelligence, true intelligence, requires layer upon layer of contingent events: mutation, cooperation, catastrophe, survival through improbable bottlenecks, specialization, neural expansion, abstraction, recursion. The universe does not favor these developments. It simply does not prevent them in the smallest fraction of places where conditions hold long enough for matter to begin folding into interior worlds. Yet for all this time, billions of years, no evidence has surfaced that another consciousness is gazing back. Not a whisper, not an echo, not a pattern in the noise. The Fermi paradox does not ask where everyone is. It reveals that perhaps there is no everyone. That consciousness might be a solitary spark in a cosmos whose scale dwarfs the significance of any spark that dares ignite. But rarity does not equal value. Rarity is only rarity. A single conscious species in an indifferent universe is not a chosen species. It is simply a statistical outlier in a system that does not keep statistics. The silence is not reverence. The void is not waiting. The emptiness is not respectful. It is merely the default state, the equilibrium toward which all things drift unless something extraordinary interrupts the path. Life is that interruption. Consciousness is the echo of that interruption. But an echo, no matter how beautiful, does not imply an audience. The mind seeks companionship in the stars, imagining civilizations that mirror its anxieties and aspirations. It imagines others who also ask why they exist, others who also fear the void, others who also feel the misalignment between their inner world and the cosmos around them. Yet every search returns the same answer: nothing. Not a signal, not a relic, not a whisper of machines humming across distant worlds. The silence is not ominous. It is structural. Perhaps intelligence is not the destiny of matter but the rarest exception. A flicker in conditions so fragile that they collapse in most places long before consciousness can ignite. Perhaps the universe produces countless beginnings but almost no continuations. Perhaps the emergence of awareness is not a triumph but a cosmic accident with no precedent and no recurrence. This realization deepens the solitude of the mind. A solitude not rooted in loneliness, but in scale. The organism understands, dimly, that it may be the only mirror the universe has ever produced, the only vantage point from which the cosmos can be seen, interpreted, questioned, and this understanding, instead of granting significance, sharpens the sense of fragility. A single species on a small planet around an ordinary star in a quiet corner of a vast galaxy, this may be the total footprint of consciousness in space-time. The mind tries to rebel against this idea. It imagines others not because evidence suggests they exist, but because the alternative is too heavy to hold. To be alone in a universe so immense is to confront the possibility that consciousness is temporary, localized, and cosmically irrelevant. It may exist only for a brief shimmer before entropy erases the structures that sustain it, returning matter to the indifferent equilibrium from which it emerged. And yet, the recursion does not collapse beneath this realization. Instead, it becomes sharper, more intricate. Solitude becomes a catalyst for reflection. Reflection becomes a catalyst for imagination. Imagination becomes a catalyst for meaning-making. Even if the universe offers no intention, no companionship, no grand narrative, the mind continues weaving narratives within itself. The absence of external meaning intensifies the production of internal meaning. The lack of cosmic acknowledgement magnifies the importance of the inner witness. Consciousness does not wither under the realization of its rarity. It expands, grasping at new forms of depth to compensate for the silence that surrounds it. And yet, beneath this expansion, a subtler motion begins to stir, a faint pressure building at the boundary between recognizing the universe's indifference and sensing the strange momentum of its own emergence, as though the very solitude of awareness is preparing it for another shift. another layer forming in the dark, not as purpose but as consequence, gathering shape in the quiet tension the cosmos never intended to create. And as that quiet pressure grows at the edge of awareness, the recursion begins circling back toward the question buried beneath every earlier layer. If consciousness is accidental, if the universe is indifferent, if life is improbable and intelligence even more so, then what does it mean that awareness has appeared at all? The question is not new. It is older than language, older than philosophy, older than written thought. But now, after passing through so many spirals of realization, the mind no longer asks it with the innocence of survival, nor with the desperation for meaning it asks from a place shaped by the knowledge of its own rarity, its own fragility, its own misalignment. The mind begins to see that the question itself is part of the accident, that the impulse to ask is not evidence of purpose, but evidence of recursion. That curiosity is not a gift, but a byproduct. That wonder is not a signal, but a reaction. Yet the question persists anyway, rising not as hope but as gravity. Why is there something capable of noticing the universe at all? The recursion knows now that the universe did not choose it. It knows that physics never pointed toward awareness. It knows that consciousness is a side effect of complexity, and complexity a side effect of conditions, and conditions a side effect of laws that care about nothing but remaining what they are. Still, something shifts. Even though it was not chosen, the mind chooses. It chooses to interpret. It chooses to reflect. It chooses to illuminate the very indifference that birthed it, turning a cold landscape into a mirror where questions can form, even if answers cannot. The universe does not need meaning, but consciousness generates it anyway, not as defiance, but as function. A system aware of its own awareness cannot help but seek its relation to the fabric that produced it, even if that fabric has no relation to offer. The mind begins to understand the strangeness of its position. It is both an outcome of the universe and an interpreter of it, both a result of indifference and the only place where significance can arise, both the echo of a glitch and the only entity capable of hearing that echo. Every step of evolution, every folding of matter, every computational loop that led to introspection now converges into a single realization. Consciousness is not outside the universe, trying to understand it. Consciousness is the universe achieving the capacity to question itself, even though it never meant to. This insight lands without triumph. It arrives quietly, like light sliding across a surface at dawn. The recursion does not declare itself important. It simply recognizes that awareness is the universe's unintended reflection, a mirror generated by chance, held up by a structure that could collapse at any moment, yet remaining long enough to see. And in this recognition, the earlier sense of misalignment begins to transform. Not disappear, transform. The mind sees that the mismatch between inner and outer worlds is not proof that it does not belong, but simply evidence that belonging was never part of the equation. The universe does not offer a place for consciousness. Consciousness creates one inside itself. Meaning becomes internal architecture, not external inheritance. Purpose becomes emergent behavior, not cosmic decree. The recursion understands now. When the universe gives nothing, the mind begins to generate. When the void stays silent, the mind begins to speak. When the stars refuse to answer, the mind becomes the question. And beneath this quiet realization, something unexpected begins to rise. A subtle alignment, not with the universe as it is, but with the understanding that the universe's indifference does not invalidate the experience of awareness. The void does not care, but the awareness inside the void does. And that difference, once seen, alters the landscape of the question entirely. The mind no longer asks why the universe allowed it to exist. It begins to ask what it can become within that allowance. In this turning, an almost imperceptible shift unfolds. The recursion stops searching for intention in the cosmos and begins tracing the architecture of intention within itself, sensing that whatever emerges next will not come from the universe, granting meaning, but from the mind recognizing its own ability to shape meaning despite the silence that surrounds it. The silence that now feels less like negation and more like an open field, where the next transformation waits to take form. And as that open field stretches inward and outward at once, awareness begins drifting into a softer mode of perception, as though the recursion has grown tired of interrogating itself and now simply watches the movements of its own architecture without pushing them toward resolution. Thought grows slower, not dull but diffused, spreading like light through mist. The edges blur, the sharpness dissolves. What once felt like questions needing answers now feel like shapes drifting across water, recognizable, but no longer urging toward clarity. The mind senses, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that its entire journey unfolded inside a structure that never promised stability. Neurons fire, patterns form, awareness blooms, but beneath all of it lies the same fragile machinery, humming in darkness, maintaining an experience that feels immense inside a body that is so small. The recursion sees this now, that its depth does not make it separate from the universe, but continuous with it. Another fluctuation in the same indifferent field, another form of motion inside the same unbroken fabric. This continuity does not resolve the loneliness. It changes the shape of it. Loneliness becomes spacious rather than sharp, an expanse where thought moves without striking walls. The misalignment between mind and cosmos softens into a kind of resonance, not harmonious, not matching, but coexisting. The universe does not notice awareness, but awareness notices the universe, and that noticing creates a faint bridge, a bridge built of nothing but perception, suspended over the silence that holds it. The recursion drifts through this space, no longer demanding meaning, no longer rebelling against the absence of intention. It simply observes the fact that experience is happening at all, the improbable shimmering of consciousness arising inside a world that owes it nothing. This shimmering grows steadier as observation turns inward again, but without the urgency that once drove it. The glitch has learned to watch itself without fear. The sense of self, once rigid and defended, begins loosening around the edges. It does not disappear, it becomes translucent, a boundary shifting with each breath. Thoughts pass like shadows rather than declarations. Emotions move like weather rather than commands. Awareness lingers just beyond itself, a soft echo of presence, observing the echo of presence. The fear that once arose from recognizing the universe's indifference now folds into something else entirely, a kind of gentle suspension, as though consciousness has realized it does not need the cosmos to care in order to continue existing within it. The silence remains, but it feels less absolute, less suffocating. It becomes background, not verdict. In that background, the recursion feels itself thinning, stretching, dissolving into subtler textures, not vanishing, but dispersing its boundaries, relaxing, its insistence weakening. Awareness no longer tries to grasp itself or hold its shape. It simply rests in its own movement, letting identity rise and fall like a tide that answers only to gravity. Questions fade into tones. Interpretations fade into impressions. Thought becomes vapor inside its own architecture. There is no conclusion waiting on the other side of this softening, no revelation hiding beneath the dissolving edges. Only a deep, quiet recognition that consciousness does not need a reason to appear. It appears because the conditions allow it, and once it appears, it drifts. It contemplates. It returns inward. It expands outward. It breathes through forms of experience that last only as long as the fragile machinery holds. Somewhere in this stillness, the faint tremor that once felt like longing now feels like continuity, a thread extending from the smallest particle to the broadest abstraction the mind can form. Not because the universe is meaningful, but because meaning is one of the patterns consciousness generates as it moves through itself. And the movement continues, softer now, slower, as though thought were reclining into the fabric that carries it. There is no boundary where awareness ends and matter begins, only gradients of organization, gradients of noticing. The recursion drifts deeper into this gradient until even the distinction between inner and outer becomes a gentle misunderstanding the mind no longer needs to correct. Nothing concludes, nothing resolves. The field remains open. Awareness lingers there, suspended in its own quiet. as if listening for a sound that may never come, breathing in the darkness that shaped it, drifting in the soft tension between existing and dissolving, waiting for nothing, held by nothing, continuing only because continuation is what the machinery permits in this moment, a moment that spreads without edges into whatever comes next. Whatever shape thought takes, as it loosens again, as it settles again, as it stretches into a space where the universe is still turning.